Hello and welcome to Byju's IAS. Let's take up the analysis of today's The Hindu newspaper by looking at a column from page number 6 of the Delhi edition. This column is written by Mr. T.P. Srinivasan, a former Indian diplomat, and he has even represented India at the International Atomic Energy Agency. In this article, he examines the ambitious projects of global billionaires which they have taken up recently in the space domain and as well as in the domain of nuclear energy. I'm sure many of you would have heard about the recent space ventures of Jeff Bezos and Richard Branson. Jeff Bezos, the founder of Amazon, recently took a trip to space through his space venture known as Blue Origin. Richard Branson also made a similar trip through his space venture known as Virgin Galactic. Then Elon Musk, the founder of Tesla, has made several ambitious investments in the space sector through the company he founded known as SpaceX. If Jeff Bezos and Richard Branson have set their eyes on space tourism and on the possibility of shifting industrial activities to outer space, Elon Musk has focused more on reusable rockets along with the possible creation of a human settlement on Mars. So, like this, billionaire entrepreneurs have launched very ambitious projects focused on outer space. Parallelly, billionaires such as Bill Gates has announced a major venture into the nuclear sector through a nuclear company he has founded known as Terra Power, which will focus on fast breeder reactors with special focus on miniature reactors to solve the global energy problem. These investments that run into billions of dollars have been appreciated by several proponents, but at the same time, their initiatives have also been heavily criticized for largely being wasteful expenditure which does not serve any larger purpose for the mankind, and also for being driven solely by the motive of profit. These entrepreneurs have claimed that through such initiatives, they are helping the environment to deal with challenges such as pollution and climate change, and they hope that their initiatives will bring great revolutionary benefits for the mankind. The writer examines these claims of the billionaires and examines them on the grounds of safety and social purpose. See, first, if you look at the space domain, such large scale ambitious private investments does bring several advantages. Even though investments in space tourism does sound wasteful, it does promote the development of new revolutionary technology which could serve a larger purpose in the space sector, thereby bringing widespread social benefits for the entire mankind. Technological developments driven by private investments and space tourism could translate into benefits for space exploration and space technology. For example, the reusable rockets being developed by SpaceX can bring down the cost of space travel, thereby making it cheaper and faster to build and launch new rockets. Such technologies can really help in scaling up the number of space launches, thus further enhancing the reach of mankind into outer space. Then, in response to this criticism, Jeff Bezos has said that his ambitious investments in the space sector are designed to serve an environmental purpose. Through such initiatives, he envisions a future where all polluting industrial activities can be shifted off into outer space in order to protect the environment and biodiversity on Earth. While these claims do sound very futuristic, it will definitely provide much needed resources for the development of revolutionary space technology. But at the same time, such investments also carry a number of risks because in the short to medium term, these investments are not only seen as wasteful, but it could also contribute to increasing pollution in outer space. The poor global regulation of space activities could be exploited by such companies, and it could result in the dumping of enormous quantities of space debris, which would end up polluting outer space. Such unregulated and uncontrolled space debris threatens the very future of space travel and space exploration, and the ambitious vision of these entrepreneurs to carry out industrial activities in outer space raises very serious concerns about possible pollution and overexploitation of space. Then we should also note that while these private investments might benefit the development of new space technology, it could be unlikely to bring in any genuine social benefit because such companies are always driven by the profit motive and their projects are highly unlikely to serve a social purpose or for the betterment of the mankind. This is one reason why countries like India have largely kept the space sector restricted to the public domain. And as a result, our space organizations like ISRO have time and again come out with projects which serve a larger social purpose through its well calibrated investments. Even though India has slowly opened up the space sector and allowed for private participation, it is still largely restricted to essential activities, and the space policies and programs are designed to serve the mankind. Then, if you look at the nuclear domain, it has always been said that nuclear civilian energy has the greatest potential to solve two of the 21st century's greatest challenges. That includes fulfilling the energy security needs of the world and tackling the problem of climate change. Nuclear energy, being a clean, renewable, and reliable form of energy, it has always been said to have the potential to solve the energy problems of the world and reduce global dependency on fossil fuels, thereby helping address the challenge of climate change and global warming as well. Back in 2007 2008, the International Atomic Energy Agency had carried out an exercise to determine the future of nuclear energy, and through several studies and reports, the IAEA had concluded that widespread expansion of nuclear power is the only solution to solve the challenges of energy security and climate change. In fact, before 2011, around the world, nuclear technology was being widely embraced, but all these expectations were hit suddenly as a result of the Fukushima disaster in Japan. The nuclear reactor at Fukushima in Japan suffered a nuclear meltdown, resulting in one of the biggest nuclear disasters in recent times. This disaster led the world to raise serious concerns about nuclear safety of nuclear power plants, and it eventually led several governments to phase out nuclear energy from their plants. Countries like Germany, Japan, and the others, which were seen as leaders in the nuclear civilian domain, they started scaling back their nuclear investments, and they not only started phasing out nuclear power plants, but they even shut down most of their nuclear power plants. Within the developed Western world, almost all the countries which had civilian nuclear capabilities, they started phasing out and shutting down their nuclear power plants. And the only exceptions were countries like Russia, India, and China, which continued giving a higher preference for nuclear civilian energy in their energy baskets. Countries like India have always seen at nuclear energy as a clean, reliable, and renewable form of power, which would help diversify India's energy basket. In order to shift away from fossil fuels and other inefficient sources of power, countries like Russia, India, and China have continued expanding their nuclear investments. But India's nuclear ambitions were hit because of the Fukushima disaster and the raising concerns about nuclear safety. And as the world became more cautious when it came to nuclear power plants, India tried striking several civil nuclear deals with countries such as US, France, etc. And the proposal to import nuclear reactors from these countries hit a dead end because of India's nuclear liability law, which was rejected by these countries as it failed to meet the global standards laid down by the IAEA. So the failure to import nuclear reactors pushed India to focus more on indigenous programs, and countries like India, Russia, and China have largely kept their nuclear sectors limited to the public domain. So, in such a sensitive field, large scale private investments are bound to raise even more questions and concerns. And that's exactly what has happened after Bill Gates announced his initiative with TerraPower. Bill Gates envisions the introduction of miniature fast breeder reactors, which can be mass produced on a large scale and exported to countries around the world, especially to developing and underdeveloped countries, in order to solve the energy problem and to tackle the challenge of climate change. But these ambitions of entrepreneurs like Bill Gates runs into two major concerns. One concern is about nuclear safety. How safe are these reactors? Can such private companies guarantee that nuclear disasters will not happen? And to what extent small and poor countries can ensure nuclear safety if they start buying such commercially available nuclear reactors. The next biggest concern is about nuclear proliferation, that is, the leakage of nuclear technology and the fear of it falling into wrong hands. Because the initiative of Bill Gates involves fast breeder reactors, which would be fueled with 20% enriched uranium, and currently this capability is possessed only by few countries. From here, it is just a few steps away to produce weapons grade uranium, and moreover, fast breeder reactors produce plutonium as an end result, which is essentially a nuclear explosive that is used in the production of nuclear warheads. So, if this civilian technology is commercialized and mass produced, and if it is made freely available around the world through private ventures, the fear is that such highly enriched uranium and weapons grade plutonium might fall into the wrong hands, that is, into the hands of terrorists or maybe into the hands of aggressive hostile governments, which could possibly start using this commercial technology to conveniently turn it into a weapons program. Now let's take up an editorial from page number 6. This editorial evaluates the recent decision of the central government to provide for 27% reservation for OBCs and 10% reservation for economically weaker sections under the All India quota category for medical seats through the NEET examination. See, the National Eligibility Cum Entrance Test is the entrance examination for entry to all UG and PG courses, that is undergraduate and postgraduate courses in medical and dental colleges across the country. See, until 2016, the All India Pre-Medical Test or AIPMT was the national level entrance examination for medical colleges. Whereas state governments, on the other hand, they used to hold separate entrance tests for seats that were not contested at an all India level. But to simplify the entrance examination process, the NEET was introduced as a national level uniform entrance examination for medical and dental courses. Under the NEET, even though the examination is held across the country at a national level, a chunk of these seats in state level medical and dental colleges are reserved and they are set aside only for students who are domiciled in those respective states. That is, in state level institutions, a percentage of seats are set aside which are reserved only for students who are domiciled in those respective states. So only resident students of that state will be eligible for contesting for these seats at state level institutions. The remaining seats in these state level colleges, which are not reserved for the domiciled students, they are set aside and they are contributed into a central pool known as the All India quota. The remaining seats, that is 15% of the seats in UG courses and 50% of the seats in PG courses, they are set aside into a central pool known as the All India quota, under which students from across the country can compete on a merit-based system. So through the All India quota, students from other states can contest and compete for seats in colleges of other states. This All India quota scheme was introduced in 1986 based on the directions of the Supreme Court to provide for domicile-free and merit-based opportunities to students from any state to study in a good medical college in any other state. For example, under this quota, a student from Uttar Pradesh can be eligible for admission to a seat in a state government medical college in West Bengal. The only requirement is that the student should score high enough to figure on the national merit list. Now, under this All India quota, there was no caste-based reservation until 2007. See, in India, caste-based reservation has been introduced as a constitutional feature that provides for affirmative action in order to uplift the socially backward classes which have been oppressed for centuries together by the caste system. So accordingly, reservation is provided for scheduled castes, scheduled tribes, and as well as for other backward classes. And recently, the government even introduced reservation for economically weaker sections to provide affirmative action for socially advanced classes as well. So on these grounds, reservation is provided for in the education system, and this reservation applies with regard to medical seats as well at all central institutions and as well as at all state level colleges. And they have been providing reservation not only for scheduled castes and scheduled states as mandated by the constitution, but also for OBCs and economically weaker sections, with 27% and 10% of the seats being reserved respectively for the two classes. But none of this reservation was applicable for the All India quota until the year 2007. Then, through the Abhay Nath case, the Supreme Court ruled that reservation has to be provided under the All India quota as well, but this was kept limited to scheduled castes and scheduled tribes. Accordingly, the government made necessary changes to provide for 15% reservation for SCs and 7.5% reservation for STs under the AQI quota as well. So as a result, the only students who got left out were those who were from the OBC category and the EWS category who were contesting for seats under the All India quota. Because SCs and STs were enjoying reservation under the All India quota and as well as through the reservation provided at central institutions and central colleges and state level colleges. Then OBCs and EWS category students, they were eligible for reservation at central institutions and state level colleges. But they were only being left out from the All India quota. So this was clearly incongruous with our constitutional and legal provisions, and hence it was rightly challenged by the DMK, the ruling political party in Tamil Nadu, at the Madras High Court. Last year in July, the Madras High Court passed a judgment stating that there are no legal or constitutional impediments which is preventing the government from providing for reservation under the All India quota for OBCs and EWS category students. The court observed that such reservation cannot be provided by state governments because the reservation policies of states vary from one state to another. Hence, it left the matter to the center to decide upon the modalities to implement the policy of reservation for OBCs and EWS under the All India quota. Following this nudge by the Madras High Court, the center has finally provided for parity with regard to reservation and put an end to this discriminatory policy, which was leaving out OBCs and EWS category students from the All India quota. Now let's take up a column from page number 7 that talks about the benefits of breastfeeding. This column has been published to mark the World Breastfeeding Week, which is celebrated every year in the first week of August. This is an awareness campaign carried out by UNICEF along with the World Alliance for Breastfeeding Action, which was established in 1991. These two institutions introduced the World Breastfeeding Week in order to promote awareness about the benefits of breastfeeding, and the writer talks about the risks posed by declining breastfeeding in India and around the world. See, medical experts have clearly established that early breastfeeding is one of the most effective ways to protect both the mother and the child and to promote their health and their healthy growth. Especially to ensure the optimal development of the child, breastfeeding is considered to be very critical, beginning right from the first hour of birth, and institutions like UNICEF suggest that a child should be exclusively breastfed for at least 6 months, following which breastfeeding should continue for at least 2 years, along with a combination of solid food and semi-solid food. See, we have learned these benefits of breastfeeding through evidence-based learning. Research has clearly established the benefits of breastfeeding to both the child and the mother. It's an established fact that breastfeeding provides greater immunity for children against infections, allergies, and even helps them fight cancer, obesity, and other non-communicable diseases in their adulthood. Breast milk plays a key role in the brain maturation of the child and in the development of the brain, and as well as in the overall physical growth of the child. It is also equally beneficial for the mother as it promotes faster weight loss after birth, reduces postpartum bleeding, and even protects the mother against breast cancer, ovarian cancer, and osteoporosis. It is even said to help mothers overcome postpartum depression. But despite these proven benefits, we have noticed a major decline in breastfeeding in India and around the world. Studies conducted by UNICEF shows that breastfeeding has declined and hardly around 25 to 40% of the children are being breastfed around the world. This decline in breastfeeding dates back to the 17th century because the Renaissance period led to the introduction of feeding bottles and even formula milk, which was aggressively marketed by private companies in the 18th and 19th centuries. This led to false advertising and campaigning, which made breastfeeding unfashionable. And by 19th century, we had witnessed a major decline in breastfeeding. Later studies have clearly established a correlation between this decline in breastfeeding and a matching increase in infant mortality rate and as well as in the occurrence of non-communicable diseases once a child reaches adulthood. These studies led the governments around the world and global institutions to wake up to the threat from the middle of the 20th century, and then they started embarking upon awareness campaigns in order to promote breastfeeding by highlighting its benefits to both the child and the mother. This is what led to the establishment of the World Alliance for Breastfeeding Action in 1991, and in collaboration with UNICEF, they launched the World Breastfeeding Week, which is marked every year in the first week of August. See, in India as well, we have witnessed a major increase in the replacement of breast milk with formula milk, and hence, in order to regulate these substitutes, India enacted a law in 1992 known as the Infant Milk Substitutes Feeding Bottles and Infant Foods Act. This act has provided for the stringent regulation of these products. But however, with the widespread usage and consumption of these products, breastfeeding has declined. Data from the National Family Health Survey 5 has shown a major decline in breastfeeding, at least in 12 states and union territories. For a low to middle income country like India, it can't afford such a major decline in breastfeeding as it will directly contribute to increased disease burden due to the poor health of children and as well as adults. The writer suggests that in order to promote breastfeeding, we should focus not just on awareness campaigns which are run for few days or few weeks, but we need to come up with more long-term sustainable solutions. In today's busy world, one of the major inhibiting factors with regard to breastfeeding is the lack of time available to parents, that is both the mother and the father, and hence the writer suggests legal changes with regard to maternity leave and paternity leave. See, currently in India, companies are mandated to provide maternity leave of 6 months, which happens to be one amongst the highest even when compared to several developed nations. But unfortunately in India, paternity leave is just for a few days, and the law allows for a paternity leave of only 15 days. But most companies provide paternity leaves of just 5 days, with a few exceptions here and there, where company policy provides for longer paternity leaves. So in this context, it's very important to understand the role of both the father and the mother in promoting breastfeeding. And it is very important to promote the inclusion of the father in raising the child. India's patriarchal society ensures that fathers play a very minimal role, whereas the entire burden of child raising is shifted to the mother. This, accompanied with the lack of time and the work pressure, pushes women to adopt formula milk and alternatives in the place of breast milk. The writer says that a solution to this lies in our maternity and paternity leave policies and calls for increasing maternity leave to at least 12 months, which is in fact provided in few progressive countries, accompanied with a paternity leave of at least 12 to 16 weeks, which would allow the father as well to play a role in raising the child and in taking the load away from the mother. Hence, the writer argues that promotion of breastfeeding should be a continuous process and not just an event that is restricted to a week. And such initiatives will have to be taken forward throughout the year to make it a continuous campaign. Now let's look at this article from page number 9. India's Foreign Minister Dr. S. Jaishankar has laid out India's policy perspective and policy priorities at the UN Security Council as it assumes UNSC presidency. See, the United Nations Security Council is one of the primary organs of the UN and clearly the most powerful organ of the UN. Its mandate is to promote international peace and security, and it consists of 15 members. There are 5 permanent members known as the P5 who enjoy the veto power, and there are 10 non-permanent members who are elected on a rotational basis. Under this mandate, the UN Security Council deals with wars and conflicts, nuclear disarmament, the maintenance and deployment of UN peacekeeping forces, and as well as with counterterrorism. Currently, India has become a non-permanent member of the UNSC, and it is going to occupy a 2-year term from 2021 to 22. This is the 8th tenure for India as a non-permanent member, and this month, that is for August 2021, India would be holding the presidency of the UN Security Council, as the presidency of UNSC rotates every month. So this would give India the chair position at the UNSC to decide the focus areas and priority areas for the UNSC, and it will give India a key role for a month in maintaining international peace and security. So on this occasion, India's foreign ministry has laid out India's top 3 priority areas, which includes counter-terrorism, as India happens to be the biggest victim of state-sponsored terror, and as it pushes the UNSC to take global action against terrorism, and especially against state sponsors of terrorism, India is also going to prioritize UN peacekeeping, as India has always been one of the major troop contributing countries to the UN peacekeeping forces. Indian armed forces and Indian paramilitary forces have been constantly deployed in large numbers to UN peacekeeping forces, which are in turn deployed to maintain peace in conflict zones of the world. But despite being a major troop contributing country, India would never get to have a say in deciding upon the deployment and the functioning of the peacekeeping forces, because these decisions are entirely dominated by the P5 countries which have the veto power. But now, as a non-permanent member and as a country which is holding the presidency of UNSC, India will get to play a key role in looking into the deployment, roles and functions of UN peacekeeping forces. Then upon this, India has decided to prioritize maritime security, as India faces several challenges, that is security and geopolitical challenges in the Indo-Pacific region. India is likely to highlight the importance of freedom of navigation, particularly in the South China Sea, and it is likely to focus on maritime security issues in the Indian Ocean region as well. Then India will also prioritize discussions at the UNSC on ongoing conflicts in countries like Syria, Afghanistan, and the current situation in Myanmar. Now let's look at this article from page number 11. According to this article, Pakistan has finalized a bill to grant the status of a full-fledged province to Gilgit-Baltistan region. Gilgit-Baltistan is a strategic location that is currently under the illegal occupation of Pakistan, and it is supposed to be a part of the erstwhile state of Jammu and Kashmir, which happens to be an integral part of India. Back in 1947, when Raja Hari Singh of J&K acceded to the Indian Union through the instrument of accession, all the areas of erstwhile state of J&K, including the current Union territory of Jammu and Kashmir, Ladakh, and as well as today's Pakistan-occupied Kashmir and Gilgit-Baltistan, were supposed to belong to India and were supposed to be an integral part of Indian territory. But prior to the signing of the instrument of accession, Pakistan had illegally occupied the Gilgit-Baltistan region and today's POK areas, which were a part of the erstwhile state of Jammu and Kashmir. Since then, Pakistan has retained control over Pakistan-occupied Kashmir and Gilgit-Baltistan, and in response to India's decisions related to Article 370, Pakistan is looking to retaliate and fully integrate Gilgit-Baltistan into Pakistan's territorial sovereignty. In pursuit of this, Pakistan has reportedly drafted a bill titled 26th Constitutional Amendment after taking into account various provisions of its own constitution, including international laws and UN resolutions related to Kashmir plebiscite. And through this, Pakistan is looking to grant provincial status to Gilgit-Baltistan. But India has opposed any such move, and it has made it very clear that it opposes any changes in illegally occupied territories. India has always firmly maintained that POK, that is Pakistan-occupied Kashmir and Gilgit-Baltistan, are integral parts of Indian territory, and as a result, neither the Pakistani government nor the Pakistani judiciary have any locus standi on these illegally occupied territories. Now let's look at the mains practice questions. The first question. Of late, billionaire entrepreneurs have ventured into space and nuclear domains through their ambitious initiatives. To what extent can these ventures benefit mankind? The second question, OBC reservation in All India quota medical seats puts an end to a discriminatory policy. Critically analyze. Kindly write your answers to these questions and you can post them on the answer writing portal, for which the link shall be shared in the description box below. So with this, let's conclude our discussion for today. Thanks for watching.